Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. This is the very first of these sessions starting in the 2022 to 2023 academic year. And we're starting off with Jeremy Corbyn, who has been a Member of Parliament for Islington North since 1983, I believe I'm correct in saying. The theme of tonight is going to be a bit of a discussion about the role of an MP and of Parliament and how it's changed during Mr. Corbyn's tenure in Parliament. And then we'll have quite a little bit of time at the end for a bit of a Q&A. So how are you doing tonight before we get started then?
Very well, thanks, Jonathan. Very well indeed. Roughly how long do you anticipate the session?
We tend to run them for about an hour. Is that okay?
An hour is fine. Yep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I guess we've had some questions that have come in that have been pre-submitted. A number of them were political questions, but we tried to not make this a political session, to make it more about the sort of role of government and the role of Parliament in the UK rather than about politics too much. But I know that you have political positions, and obviously so do I, and you know, we're not going to go to extreme lengths to try and hide them, but we'll try to focus as much as we can on the role of an MP and on the role of government. So what I want to start off by asking you was, when you first, if you like, applied to become an MP, or when you first started that process, what was it you thought you were signing up for, and did it turn out the way that you expected?
I came to it from the point of view of being an active political person. I have been all my life. I came to the point of view from being a councillor in a neighbouring borough of Haringey, and I was also a union organiser for the then National Union of Public Employees. It's now part of Unison, and I obviously was invited, in fact, by people in Islington North to put my name forward. And for those of you that are students of political history will know that 1982, which is when this all happened, was a time of intense debate within the Labour Party, as the Social Democratic Party had just been founded. And the MP for Islington North had indeed joined the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, and so he was no longer a Labour MP. And I was being invited to put my name forward as the Labour candidate, which I did. What was I expecting? To try and represent the area, which is inner city, mixed, great poverty, great stress. Also to speak out on a lot of political and policy issues around foreign policy, as well as around redistribution of power and wealth within Britain. This was a time Thatcher had been in office for 3 years at that point. We had the Falklands War, and we also had the beginnings of massive levels of privatisation by Thatcher, and many of us felt the Labour Party's response was not strong enough to all this. So it was a combination of reasons. What do I expect from it? A great deal of pressure to try and do things in the constituency, as well as to be active in Parliament. And so it was obviously then, and always is, if you do the job fully, quite difficult to balance all the things out. But you should never, ever forget the constituency or the community you represent. And indeed, the bedrock of what an MP does ought to be the representation of the needs of their constituents, which are even in relatively wealthy areas of the country, some people with profound needs who need to be represented on housing benefits and immigration and asylum issues, which I do all the time.
And obviously, so you ran for Parliament in the 1980s, and I'm just wondering, what was that experience like? I would imagine it's somewhat different from running for Parliament now. In particular, getting selected as an MP, how do you think that process has changed a little bit in that time?
The selection was very different then within the Labour Party, because the Labour Party then had a delegate-based system for selection at a local level. The General Management Committee was made up of delegates from each party branch and each affiliated trade union and each affiliated social society. And the focus was on me getting nominations from party branches and unions to have sufficient to be on the shortlist, which I did. And then It was a question of how the delegate body would vote. There was it was an intense period. There were a lot of ballots before I was finally chosen. In fact, I was chosen by 4 votes at the end of the 5th ballot.
Ah, so it was and the member who you narrowly beat did also go on to become an MP at a later point, didn't they?
Well, the 2 things here. One is the sitting MP was a gentleman called Michael O'Halloran, who stood as an independent Labour in that election and lost. Although I did have a legal tussle with him because he tried to use the name Labour in the campaign. The person who was the runner-up in the selection process was Paul Boateng, and he did indeed go on to become an MP for Brent South at a subsequent election. Obviously, over the years, got to know Paul very well. And so whilst there were political differences, it wasn't off the scale. And I've, on a personal level, got on very well with Paul over the years. And still do. And still do.
Obviously, you yourself are an opposition MP and have been a backbench MP for a very long time. But the window of time that Labour was in government, 1997 through to 2007, strikes me as a time when being an MP and being in government changed quite a lot. I mean, Twitter was invented during that window of time. The first iPhone was released, I think, during that window of time. Facebook. I'm curious how you think these things might have changed the role of an MP. I know that you're quite active on those platforms.
Totally changed politics completely. From the time of my election, the high point of high technology in an MP's office was a golf ball typewriter. Now, I don't know if any of the wonderful group from the OU that are on this call tonight have ever heard of a golf ball typewriter. Put it in the chat if you have. Yes, somebody's come out. Jarvis, IBM typewriter. Well done, Jarvis. Spot on. Staff member, old enough to remember. Yeah. Okay. I had the first golf ball typewriter on the Seven Sisters Road. And later on, computers came in the form of Amstrad computers, which we used in my office. I always tried to keep as up to date as we possibly could with technology. Mobile phones came a bit later on. And so communications with the electorate was in a very different way. It was leaflets, it was door knocking, it was a great deal of leafleting and a great deal of handing out leaflets all over the place, which has now changed dramatically. And I have to say, I find it, looking back on it, I find it really strange. We'd worked really hard, produce 10,000 leaflets overnight, distribute them all the next day and think we'd done really well. And I can reach 1 million people in a minute. On social media. Now, whether they're all reading it or taking it in or not is another matter. So it's completely different. It was much more one-to-one campaigning. And it tended to be that because it's one-to-one campaigning and door knocking rather than social media interaction, you talk to people who are in at their homes who tend to be older people or people with young families. It tends not to be young people who don't have children and responsibilities to go with it. So to reach a large proportion of the electorate was very different and very difficult. And so that campaign in 83 general election, to me, first time candidate for a parliamentary election, I've been elected to a council. We did an enormous number of canvassing sessions, door-to-door events and public meetings. These days, the number of public meetings in elections are much less, although in the 2 general elections in which I led the party, I did over 100 rallies and events in each of those election campaigns, because I do think the physical participation is so much better than the virtual participation, as we're having now. How much nicer it would be if we were all in the same room.
I'm quite inclined to agree. I've played a similar role. Someone's actually asking if I could introduce myself a little bit, and sure, my name's Johnathan Doran. I play host to these little sessions, and I'm a researcher and a student of law at the Open University. I've had these similar sessions before at different universities where they're physical, they're in person, and I completely agree. It's a very different atmosphere, but it's somewhat in the nature of the OU that we try to do it in this format. But I completely agree that physical being in the same room.
Well, the OU was created to be the University of the Air, and I remember Harold Wilson and Jenny Lee talking about it. I'm old enough to remember that, and to us, it was. We all thought it was a bit wacky to begin with. You know, how could you have a university that's not in a building? And I remember discussing it in a Young Socialist meeting, and they decided it was a good idea. So it had a badge of approval from the Young Socialists in Shropshire in the 1960s, and then Jenny Lee was our neighbouring MP, and it was founded in, of course, 1968.
And back then, the air, of course, wasn't even the internet. It would have been television broadcasting late.
Indeed. And I have never done an Open University course, or indeed any other university course for that matter. Sorry, the cat. Can you go away, please?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to.
The cat is very angry because the cat thinks it's time for his supper, which it possibly is.
It's the opposite of a hard-hitting question, but what's the cat's name? I feel like I have to ask now.
El Gato.
El Gato. Oh, fantastic! Yeah. That's an excellent name for a.
It's very exotic sounding, but it is just Spanish for the cat.
It's a fantastic name for a cat.
No, he's somebody's now feeding him. Lara's now feeding him. Sorry about that.
No, my dogs are safely contained downstairs to avoid that kind of situation from happening, because they would intervene. Just briefly then, so you spoke a bit about the kind of quality of communication that you get from your participation in social media and things like that. Do you think that it really makes a difference, or does it just end up being a sort of venue for people to express opinions that they probably already hold?
I think it makes a difference, and I think there's a different style and quality of discussion between Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and so on. I send out quite a lot of stuff on social media. It is very good at mobilizing people to come to events. It can be quite good at expressing an opinion on a matter of importance at the time. Sometimes people are too quick to express opinions. And amongst MPs, there is a sort of feeling they must be seen to be on social media within seconds of any announcement. And I was sitting through the budget statement last Friday in Parliament, and you can follow it on your phone. And people are already commenting when the Chancellor wasn't even into the second paragraph.
Yeah.
And now they couldn't possibly have known what the rest of it was. But they already sort of decided to make comments. So I think there is that temptation and that problem. But look at it another way. It does mean an awful lot of people participate very quickly. And it means politics is completely different. We used to think in the when I was elected in the 1980s, in terms of newspaper deadlines and print journalists who would be hanging around outside the Chamber of Parliament to get a comment from you in the parliamentary lobby. And you would try to make sure you got a comment to them before whatever their deadline was, 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock, whatever it happened to be. Deadlines simply do not apply anymore. There is no such thing, because all newspapers are online as well as physical. And so it is a 24-hour news cycle. Interestingly, when Sky News first appeared, it was pretty low tech. I mean, they used to have a mobile phone sort of strapped to a camera in order to take the voice down the phone and take the film another way. It developed quite quickly, but they were a rolling news channel. The BBC then rivaled them and set up a rolling news channel, but they often couldn't get people to go on it, and they would often have quite long periods where they have very long interviews with people. I remember doing a news piece one Sunday night on BBC News 24. This would be about 11 o'clock, and after I'd finished my interview, they said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "Well, I'm going to go home. Do you have some other suggestions? Would you mind hanging around and doing a bit more at the same after midnight, because we can't get anybody to come on?" So you could actually almost turn up there and just camp out in the studio. And be honest, it's not like that at all now. It's much more pressurized. But 24-hour news has completely changed things.
Yeah. So having had a bit of a look then at how one might get oneself elected to Parliament and how you connect with voters and with constituents once you are elected. So we're currently living through a bit of as you've pointed out, a sort of fiscal moment at the minute, and there's a lot of things being reported on the television, a lot of tension building up in the country. But Parliament isn't currently sitting. Do you believe that it should be?
Yes, I do.
And what would yourself and your colleagues be doing if it were?
Well, first of all, it ought to be sitting. I mean, the recesses to allow for the conferences, and then the Queen's death came along, and so the Liberal Democrat conference was cancelled anyway as a result of that. And then the recess started. Labour held the conference this week and the Conservatives next week. There is no reason why Parliament couldn't have been recalled yesterday and today, for example, because the economic statement last Friday, for which we were recalled for, clearly has not had the effect the Chancellor claimed it was going to have. That must be very obvious to everybody. He is under a huge amount of pressure because of the inflation figures, the falling value of the pound, and the fact that there is no public appetite for the tax redistribution, because that's how it should be described, and he's put forward. Now, the problem about recalling Parliament really goes to the heart of the issue of parliamentary power. Parliament, we all think of as a body independent of government, etc., and holding government to account. The theory, absolutely correct. A couple of things. One is, when the Speaker is elected, the Speaker's election as the Speaker of the House, the Chair of the House, is subject to royal approval. That goes back to the English Civil War in 1688. The independence of Parliament is fettered by that. Now, there is no point in the last few hundred years where the Crown has said they don't agree to X being Speaker, but there's a point there of that residual power. Secondly, if in a recess you want to recall Parliament, it can only be done with the agreement of the Prime Minister. It cannot be recalled by any number of members demanding it, or the Speaker even, because I attempted to get Parliament recalled when Boris Johnson was trying to keep Parliament in a near permanent recess, it seemed, during the intensity of Brexit negotiations. I had long discussions with the Speaker then, John Bercow, about this, and he said, look, I may or may not agree with you about Parliament being recalled, but it can only be done if the Prime Minister agrees. And I obviously put pressure on Boris Johnson, along with the leaders of all the other parties. No dice, he wouldn't do it. He just said, no, I'm not doing it. So eventually, unprecedented in British history, 2019, he was taken to court. And we were made, the Labour Party, that is, under my direction, was made into an associate of the case being taken up. And so we were actually a party to the case, which eventually the Supreme Court ruled that Parliament ought to be sitting. And that was their view of the Constitution. Very rare interpretation of constitutional power by the Supreme Court. I think it moves us helpfully into the direction of a much more defined constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people would share that view. Probably people who are legally minded on this call take a similar view in many cases. So having said that you think that Parliament should be recalled, I'm wondering what would MPs be doing at this minute if it were recalled? What does it look like being a backbencher holding government to account?
For quite a lot of the stuff that Kwarteng wants to do, he's got through the immediate tax changes and the ones that he wants, but there is other legislation that's got to go with it. The other thing is, he made a statement that was completely uncosted. He didn't say how much the support is going to be for the energy companies, and he didn't say what the cost is going to be of the tax changes. And so that is a requirement that he's got to put before Parliament. So the demand would be that, and the demand would be he's got to bring forward legislation to deal with the energy issue. All they've said is they're going to give a large amount of money to energy companies without saying how much, all the while protecting their profits, at the same time giving us all 100% increase in electricity bills.
And so on a sort of day-to-day level, what would that look like then in terms of trying to hold the government to account for those shortcomings? What would you be doing?
Obviously, the Conservatives have a majority in Parliament. I get that, of course. But a lot of Conservative MPs are very annoyed about it. I always tried to construct some sort of resolution which would attract the support of other opposition parties and some dissident Conservatives. There is a lot of distance in the Conservative Party about this, and so I think that would be the form of debate. But it would mean that there would be, the Chancellor would be forced then to give us more detail. At the moment, they can get away with it because they can simply just say, we're not saying. And indeed, he hasn't done that many interviews himself either. The Prime Minister's done some, it appears mostly on local radio, and it was only the Financial Secretary to the Treasury was on Radio 4 this morning and unable to answer any of those questions. It is absurd that the government proposes to spend billions of our money on supporting energy companies and can't even tell us how much it is.
So beckoning back then to when you first became an MP in 1983 and talking about how things have changed somewhat today, what are some things that are different in terms of your day as an MP? What are some things that you were maybe a bigger part of your time back in when you first started, or a small part of your time that maybe has changed to?
From my own personal point of view, I've always focused on being a constituency representative. I opened a constituency office straight after I was elected in 1983, which was actually slightly unusual at the time, and based myself in the constituency rather than in Parliament. In those days, parliamentary sessions began at 2:30 in the afternoon. They now generally, most days apart from Monday, start earlier than that and finish earlier. In that time, Parliament often went very late, so quite often you'd be there till 2, 3, even 4 in the morning, and then you get home, and then you've got your day starting again at 9 o'clock. So I found it utterly exhausting because of the excessively long hours. Now, whether they were beneficial or not, I don't know, but in those days there was much less use of a guillotine procedure on legislation, and so you could win concessions by keeping them up very, very late. And indeed, one of the activities that the late, great Tony Banks and myself were involved in was defending the Great London Council, but also slightly later on, making sure that London buses were not deregulated like the rest of the country was. And so some small victories were achieved by utterly dogged parliamentary activities. And I remember another MP, Bob Cryer, the late Bob Cryer, MP for Bradford South at the time, was determined to prevent the closure of the Settle to Carlisle railway line, which runs from Carlisle eventually through Settle down to Leeds. He felt that a lot of dishonesty had been used about the alleged condition of the line. It should be kept open. And he just raised the issue endlessly, day after day after day, with points of order, resolutions, backbench debates, questions, and so on and so on. And eventually he won, and the line was kept open. So by sort of dogged activity, you could achieve change. It's very different now because Parliament is meets for less amount of time. A lot of it is dominated very heavily by social media. And the government uses timetable motions and guillotines on all pieces of legislation, which all sounds very efficient, but in reality, it means that most major bills are simply not examined by the House of Commons. If you get a 70-clause bill and that's debated on a second reading, the vote is taken, it is agreed on second reading, with it obviously not amended at that point, goes to committee. Committee is set to last for 6 weeks, probably don't get beyond clause 30. There could be some major issues within those. That means that 30 or 40 clauses are not examined in committee at all. Report stage done in 1 day, no examination there. It's left to the House of Lords, if they feel like it, to examine it and send back any amendments later on. A great deal of legislation goes through that is simply not examined properly. Other thing that's changed has been the role of select committees. I personally support the idea of select committees, but they cannot themselves directly legislate. They can report, and it's the government that could then decide whether to legislate or not. And so I think my views would be much more of empowering of Parliament by giving them the right to legislate. I'll give you another example on right to legislate. If for tomorrow Parliament was recalled, or Monday Parliament was recalled, and an opposition motion was put saying that the Chancellor was wrong in his statement, and it was carried as a decision of Parliament. It could not be binding on the government because it had been an opposition motion. Only legislation and motions that emanate from the government, albeit that could be amended, can become binding on a government. And I think that is a fundamental weakness of the power of the House of Commons.
So
and I say that as somebody that led the opposition, and you might say, well, I would welcome that sort of convenience of government power over Parliament. Yes, of course, there's an attraction to it, but it's actually not a healthy form of democracy.
So you mentioned the House of Lords really briefly there, and I think I'll pull the first question out of the chat on that basis. Do you think that the UK will ever have an elected upper chamber?
Yes, I do. I wish I could say how soon. The general proposal I put forward was for the abolition of the House of Lords and the election of an upper chamber based on representation of English economic regions. So you'd have North, Northwest, Midlands, East Midlands, West Midlands, East Midlands, Eastern region, South, Southwest, and London probably is a separate region, plus representation from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which would do a number of things. One is it would not be controlled by any one party. Secondly, it would guarantee representation of all regions of the whole of the UK and nations. And you would have to legislate to say that the ultimate power lies with the House of Commons as it does now, following the Parliament Act of 1911. But that would mean you had a second chamber that could introduce legislation and could revise legislation and would have powers of delaying. But I think it's very hard to defend the principle of the House of Lords with 750 peers, not one of whom has been elected there, all of whom are there for life, and a small number of them there, and their children will be there after them, a very small number of hereditary peers. I just cannot defend the principle of the House of Lords.
So I must admit, I agree largely with that position, but there's one redeeming feature that I think the House of Lords has, and that it's because the positions are permanent, it removes them from temporary sort of fleeting political appetites. It allows them to, I'm not saying that they necessarily do this, but it allows them, if they so wish, to take decisions that wouldn't necessarily be popular in a given moment, because they're not accountable in the next coming years. Do you see any redemption there, or would you think that a longer term might be a good idea?
I see the issue of inevitable short-termism, because a government is elected and clearly its sights are on the maximum length of its term, and in reality, yes, the law is 5 years, but in reality it is 3.5 years, and then you're getting into an election period anyway. So government has got to act pretty fast in order to take any long-term decisions. But no other country that I can think of has an unelected chamber that can go on forever. Now, sometimes, yeah, I'm not saying there aren't members of the House of Lords who do a very good job at demanding and revising, and in particular the ex-judges and retired lawyers are often very good on challenging this government's human rights legislation and others. But there's no reason to say that an upper chamber on maybe a different term length to the House of Commons. There'd be no reason why it should be exactly the same, and the elections maybe shouldn't be on the same day either. So you would still have the power of government reliant on a majority in the House of Commons, the lower chamber, but you would have this much broader representation, because the House of Lords, 80% of its members live within 5 miles of the House of Lords. You can't call that representation of the country as a whole.
No. So maybe moving to something that we slightly disagree on, possibly, before going back to
we disagree.
Well, we'll find out, possibly. So proportional representation is another question from the chat box.
Okay. I haven't seen. I can tell you what. I'm going to put the chat up on my screen because I just see the flashes coming up. 1 second.
So
go ahead.
I personally struggle somewhat with PR, because I think when you look at the countries that have a PR system, you often find that, I guess I struggle with the democratic aspect of it, because I feel like because the parties end up being so small in their overall composition as part of a government, there's a lot of space in there for kind of backroom dealing and you know, 4 or 5 parties having to come together to form a government, and in exchange they can all trade off policies as they feel they need to in order to form that government. And it means that there's not a sort of single party, a single political entity that can be held to account for their manifesto, at least not completely and entirely. And so I somewhat struggle with PR, and I think for my age, my generation, that makes me a bit of an outlier. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on PR, and if you think that the UK will ever become a PR system.
I think there probably will be a form of PR eventually in Britain. I come at it from the point of view that I represent a geographical constituency, and I'm very proud to do that and enjoy doing that. And any system to me must maintain the constituency basis and constituency link, so that every area of the country geographically elects a member of parliament. Now, you could do PR in a number of ways. One would be to have runoff ballots for the election of MPs, but that doesn't necessarily give you any proportionate representation. In fact, if anything, it probably empowers the centre ground and drives political debate to the centre ground. The other way is to have a supplementary list based on regions, where you would have, say, reduce the size of the House of Commons from 650 to say 500, and have 150 elected by regional lists based on party strength, which would then even up and balance out the over or under representation of each party. Does it lead to unstable governments? Well, we used to have the view that Britain would always elect a majority government because we had first past the post. That decreasingly has happened. Since 2010, we've had 2 elections which did not produce a majority and resulted in a huge amount of horse trading, and Theresa May's narrow win in 2017 basically empowered the Democratic Unionist Party beyond belief, and they got what they wanted out of it. So will we get PR? Eventually, probably yes, but my position would be I wouldn't want to see a total list system. I'd want to maintain the constituency link. The other point about it is that link is important. I've never forgotten meeting Dutch MP many years ago, and I was chatting to him about the work of MPs and so on. I said, what do you do with constituents' casework? How do you cope with it? And he looked at me and said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you know, people come to me about housing, immigration and planning and all those kinds of things. He said, why? I said, well, it's because it's what worries them. He said, well, we don't get involved in any of that because I'm on a national list. Now, a national list means that the party machinery becomes even more powerful than it already is. Yeah. And MPs are then competing with each other to be in a high place on the list. Look at the jockeying that goes on, or did go on, for members of the European Parliament, which was totally a list system. Yeah. And for many, the only real political debate was about where they were on the party list, and I always thought that was more than a mistake. Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess before I move on to the Q&A and maybe take some questions from the audience, we invited you along to speak about how the role of an MP has changed over your time in Parliament. I'll just ask you that question then. How has the role changed during your time in Parliament?
It's changed because there is more and more people making demands of MPs. Huge volume of correspondence coming in. We get emails coming in during most days every 30 seconds, sometimes more often than that. Some of them are campaigning emails, fair enough, and we obviously read what they have to say and then give a general reply to all of them. But it's meant that you have to be much more accountable than the days when people wrote letters or came to advice surgeries. I still do advice surgeries because I like doing them. I like meeting people one-to-one. And the high-tech world in which we live excludes a disturbing number of people. People that, particularly during COVID, not going to make a phone call, not going to send an email, certainly not going to follow you on social media, and will have no contact with you at all. These are the people I meet walking around the streets who sometimes it's a language problem, sometimes it's other issues, and so there is a danger of them being ignored and excluded. Secondly, it is the pressure of social media and national media on MPs, and also the hypercritical nature of the way in which social media operates. Now, I do put a lot of stuff out on Twitter and Facebook because I think it's a good way of engaging people and it's a good way of mobilizing people. But I tell you, some of the abuse is unbelievable, and some of the threats that are made are really quite disturbing. Now, if there's somebody making a direct and overt threat, then I do report them.
You've landed on the last thing I was going to ask you, because it's quite a sort of quite a sobering question. I did a bit of a cursory glance at the number of MPs killed while in office since 1800, and I'd sort of hoped that it wouldn't be something I could point to as a thing that's changed over the course of your political career, but it seems like it probably is. About half of the MPs killed since 1800 have been killed. It's within a few years of you joining Parliament. What's brought this about? Why is that? Why are those numbers so disproportionately recent rather than historic?
Degree of violence in society, and the sort of security atmosphere that has been created. I hate the idea of being cut off from people. I hate the idea of not being able to talk to people. And so I do walk around my constituency. I do talk to people all the time, and I think MPs should be open to meet their constituents, but obviously you have to be cautious if somebody is trying to attack you. I have to say that I have been physically abused in my office a very small number of times. I have had a number of assaults made upon me, but not very many. Obviously, it's a terrible thing. It's actually more worrying and more frightening for partners and family than it is for anybody else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can appreciate that. It's obviously a horrible trend that seems to have emerged since you've started your political career. Just turning then to the Q&A and the attendees here. I think one person has already said that they're quite happy to ask their question via the mic, which will mean that...
Sure, that'd be fine. I'm trying to keep up with the questions. There was one question I just made deal with it. There was, I think somebody put in a question saying they were doing a law course and they were wondering how this affected them. Could I just say that I think that the legislation aspect of Parliament is a real problem about the degree of examination of bills. Now, I am not legally qualified. Some MPs are, most are not. And you have an enormous number of things coming across your desk at any one time, an enormous number of issues and a huge pile of local issues that you have to be involved with as well. And this is the problem area, that a bill might be there. It might have some terrible or very dramatic thing buried away in it somewhere, which nobody's noticed. And it relies on other people to draw their attention to it. So being an MP does mean you've got to be able to read very fast and try to understand what the nature of the legal proposal in front of you is. I've been a member of a number of select committees. I was a member of the Justice Select Committee, and we were able to use the Justice Select Committee to get an inquiry into the law on joint enterprise. And I managed to get JENGBA, Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association campaign, giving evidence to that. That helped quite a lot. Likewise, we examined the question of the Criminal Cases Review Board and its effect on major miscarriages of justice, and crucially, a lot about legal aid and issues like that. So there are various ways of lobbying which are not necessarily on the floor of the House. It is about select committees, and so it is important to understand that you've got to actually try and change law as you go along, but it does require you to spend an awful lot of time and effort to do it.
You've sort of landed on an interesting thing that I'd like to mention in that case. Then you might not know that last year one of our attendees was John McDonnell, MP, someone who obviously you know rather rather well.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And part of my research is on scientific expertise and scientific expertise as a legal phenomenon. And I'd asked him the question of whether he ever felt somewhat sort of vulnerable when having to rely on expert counsel and guidance in the lawmaking process, because you can't be expected to understand all the intricacies of the various things that you have to address as a legislator. He had said that he felt that you developed a nose over time for someone who is sort of manipulating the facts because they have a certain agenda, or someone who's misrepresenting the facts as you need to understand them. I was wondering if you agreed with that, or if you took a different view.
Yeah, you do get people throwing statistics around a lot, particularly on social media, often unsourced. And I think you have to be very careful about quoting unsourced statistics on anything. Debate on climate, for example, is a very serious one, a very obvious one. But again, it has to be grounded in science and so on. As to advice, I've been there, as you know, a long time, and so I tend to have a number of people I can call on and say, well, look, I don't understand this particular legal process that's going on. This would be friends who are lawyers. Could you explain it to me? And they do so. Ditto science and engineering issues. And what I find sad is that the majority of MPs come from either a legal or an academic background, or in a case mainly of Conservatives, a business background. There are very few who are engineers or scientists who therefore understand the implications of some of the stuff that we're doing. There are a lot of all-party groups, and the House of Commons Library is very good at producing very high-quality briefings in a very short space of time, which I do use a great deal. But the issue is always dealing with the sheer volume of things. But it's very easy to get carried away in Parliament and think you're going to do this, that, and the other and achieve it all. You've always got to think back, well, how is this helping the poorest and most vulnerable people in my constituency? And you've always got to bear in mind where you've come from. That's what democracy should be about.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Do lawyers make good MPs, out of curiosity?
Well, some of them make brilliant MPs because they speak like barristers in the chamber and will go to the heart of a legal argument. I mean, people can be great MPs, whatever they've done beforehand. I mean, my background was a trade union organizer, which a lot of trade union organizing, because you're representing members and employment issues, is actually fairly legal. I also came from a local government background, so I had quite a big interest in housing and planning, because those were the areas that concerned me greatly as a local councillor. And so, yeah, the background helps. I do think that going into Parliament too young is not necessarily a good idea. Now, I was first elected when I was 33, which was seen as quite young. And I'm not against young people being in Parliament, obviously, but you're going to be there a very long time. You've got to work out how you're going to keep yourself grounded in your community, and how you don't get sucked into being lobby fodder for commercial interests, or get besotted by the trappings of office and power, actually, which are really a bit of a nonsense.
John McDonnell made the exact same point. You'd be happy to hear you're on the same page on that one.
Not surprised.
So I'll start taking some questions then from the floor. If anyone's happy asking their question in their own voice, then if you just raise your hand, then I'm happy to do that. But I'll start off with Carla. Carla?
Hiya, I'm here.
Fantastic.
Hi, Carla.
A third voice.
Hello. So my question is, do you think becoming an MP is harder or easier now than when you were first elected?
Probably harder, because the selection process is longer. I don't think it is a terribly fair process within my own Labour Party, and a great deal of money can be spent on trying to get selected and get communications to all those that can vote. There are limits on the amount that can be spent within the Labour Party, but I do think it's probably much harder. I have always supported all women shortlists to even it up, and now about half of Labour MPs are women, which I think is a good thing. And my shadow cabinet was always at least 50% women, because I believe there should be equality in politics. As to representation beyond gender, there's issues of the underrepresentation of people with disabilities and the underrepresentation of different ethnic communities within our society. So being elected to Parliament is an enormous honour. It's difficult to achieve, and probably become more difficult to achieve, partly because of greater numbers of people that want to do it, and the pressures that are on them to try and achieve it. But I do say to people who want to become MPs, I always ask them the question, why? Why? And I say, look, you've got to have a cause, you've got to have a passion, you've got to be determined to push that passion through, and it's never going to be easy. And at times you're going to be very unpopular.
So it's interesting that you say why, because you've got someone here who I think probably aspires to something like Parliament. So this is Eleanor from the comment section. Hi Jeremy, I've just been elected into my local town council. What recommendations would you have for someone just starting out, and what changes did you make that stick out the most for you?
If you're on a town council, well done, good luck. Look at what you can do. Look at what you can do in motivating people to bring about change. Look at the quality of open space, quality of parks, quality of housing. I realise town council powers are quite limited, but there's quite a lot you can do in poring over planning applications from the district council, county council, or whatever it happens to be, and give your opinions to it.
Fantastic. Christy Holland has said that she's happy to ask her question in our own voice. So Christy, can we hear you?
Hello.
We can indeed.
Hi, Christy.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask, do you mentioned the Supreme Court case that was brought against Boris Johnson in 2019. Just in considering the conduct that led to that, do you think that ruling will have an impact on the conduct of future leaders and governments going forward?
He was a particularly swashbuckling prime minister and approach to it, and he just felt he could ride roughshod over Parliament, and then eventually found the Supreme Court against him. The depressing thing was that this wasn't seen as a major criticism by an awful lot of the media in the subsequent election campaign. And he presented it as being his determination to get Brexit done, whatever the consequences. Whereas a lot of people said, hang on a minute, is it really right that the Prime Minister should try to prevent Parliament from meeting, which was going to be critical of him? Will it make things different for the future? Yes, I think it will, because there is a Supreme Court ruling there, and any Prime Minister, current one onwards, will be very scared of getting back involved in that sort of legal tussle. But again, the setting of parliamentary business, parliamentary recesses, and so on, which is a highly political decision, is completely in the hands of the government. It's not put to a vote. And this brings me on to the issue of the Royal Prerogative, which is sounds grand, remote and ancient, but in reality the Royal Prerogative is where Parliament can be overridden, not by the Crown, but by the Prime Minister, acting on behalf of the Crown as the purveyor, if you like, of the Royal Prerogative. It was used a lot by many Prime Ministers.
It's interesting you say that that case represents a significant obstacle for future Prime Ministers, because it didn't seem to, the PM at the time didn't seem to give any indication that they were particularly bothered by it, or that it represented any kind of significant blow to them particularly.
But remember, that any prime minister that sort of says they're mindful of extending the parliamentary recess by another month or something to avoid an unfortunate debate or possibility of defeat, their civil servants are going to be saying, look, this is what happened to the previous prime minister. Now, the courts are understandably very reluctant to intervene on any kind of parliamentary process because there is separation between political and legal process, and there should be. But it has made a difference of that, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Could we take a few more? Would that be okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. How about Rebecca Polly in that case?
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
Oh, hi, Jeremy. God, that was brought on me quickly.
Sorry.
Oh,
you did raise your hand.
By it, then.
You did raise your hand.
I just, yeah, I guess I just wanted to ask how you felt about the Labour Party at the moment. I've just come back from conference and I saw you there, and I felt it was relevant to bring that up because obviously heading into the next election, you are looking potentially to stand as an independent.
Well, I think it's completely wrong that I have not been readmitted to the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I think the publication of the Ford report, the leaked document after the HRC report, and the Al Jazeera documentaries indicate just what I was up against in trying to reform the Labour Party and the Labour Party structures. So I'm obviously want to see this government defeated. I want to see it replaced with a Labour government. I want to see that Labour government determined to genuinely redistribute power and wealth. Now, I feel I've been extremely badly treated in this process, and I carry on with my work representing the community, and I do all the political work I've always done, and I'll carry on doing that. I think the Labour Party ought to reinstate me.
So, how about one more, and then I'll ask you one for myself, and we'll call it an evening, because I'm mindful that of your time. I don't want to keep you here.
That's fine.
You'll have seen from the Q&A that if we were to ask every question that was submitted, we would be here until the early hours of the morning. So we'll have to draw a line at some point. How about Nazareno? Would that be a possibility if I was to ask you to?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Hello, Nazareno.
Hello, nice to meet you, and thank you for being here with us. So I'm not a law student, I'm a business school student. So my question is about economic policy. And so recently the government imposed a mini budget, which means that the government will be borrowing about £72 billion. And I believe that you label this as irresponsible in the Political Thinking podcast. So you also added that the Labour policy goes towards issues such as poverty and unemployment. So this week in The Economist, it showed that Britain's inflation is roughly 10% and unemployment is 3.6%. So would you be worried that reducing unemployment will likely cause some inflation spike, as it happened, for example, in the Czech Republic with a 2.3 unemployment and almost 18% inflation? And if trickle-down economics are sort of the wrong economic policies, how will Labour address the current situation in Britain? Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for your question. First of all, we've had falling wages for the past 12 years, generally speaking. For those on average middle and lower incomes, have all had either pay freezes or, in some cases, pay cuts or increases less than inflation. So their living standards have fallen. Nobody can say inflation is caused by wage-led inflation at the present time. There is also a huge shortage of workers in many industries, particular skill shortages in many places. The government believes they can kickstart the economy by reducing what they choose to call the tax burden on the very richest by ending the 45 pence in the pound for those earning over 150,000, but also by reducing the basic rate of income tax. Everybody's better off. Well, everybody is slightly better off, very, very slightly better off if you're on a minimum wage, very much better off if you're on 100,000 a year or 145,000 a year. And so it's simply wrong to assume that by changing course of this, it's going to make a very big difference. I think the government has made a fundamental mistake. Now, the Chancellor, the amount of money they're borrowing is borrowing for day-to-day expenditure, is borrowing to prop up the energy companies, whereas I put forward proposals in the last general election, which were to borrow for investment in housing, health, education, and all the other things. It's simply wrong to borrow for day-to-day expenditure. That is a real problem, and I think that Kwarteng is going to have to fess up to that.
Just going to smuggle one quick one in because it was asked a few times in the comment section. Criminal barrister strike, is that something you would support, or you do?
Yes,
support?
I do, because I know everybody thinks barristers earn loads of money. Yeah, there are some barristers that earn phenomenal sums of money, and absolutely huge. A very, very small number. I know people who live around here who are young barristers who've worked very hard to be qualified, criminal process barristers who get paid less than the minimum wage for what they actually do, work very, very hard and get very little reward for it. And because of the cuts in legal aid, which is what's behind all this, it means that many people simply do not get access to justice, do not get access to fair justice. And so legal aid should be seen as part of the welfare state. The right to housing, the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, and the right to justice. That's what it was brought in for, which is why I spent an awful lot of time on the Justice Select Committee demanding an increase in legal aid and legal aid budgets and access to legal aid.
Must admit, my eyes were turning towards the attendee number there to see if you'd deterred any prospective law students from continuing down the path that they may have set for themselves, but it seems to have remained steady. I don't think
my lawsuits or somebody lawsuits against me.
No, I was watching the attendee count for this meeting just to see if, as you were talking about the poor conditions for criminal barristers, if any law students may be reconsidering at this point and deciding to go and pursue other things. So yeah, one last little final question before we wrap up then. So you started as an MP in the 1980s and we're talking now in 2022. Would you do it again?
Yes, absolutely. It is a very, very mixed job. But the interest of it is being able to work with people, motivate people, and mobilize people. My whole purpose is to have an education system and a society that doesn't leave people behind and ignore them. We have too much of a hyper competitive education system that's so damaging to young people and their mental health. And so I spend my time basically working with communities, with groups, trying to mobilize and motivate them as to what can be achieved in society. Too much of our world is disempowering of the individual. I want to empower people as a sense of community. So I'll be out there tomorrow with the rail workers and the postal workers and many others. And I was out with them this morning as well. And so I find the job, to say satisfying would be wrong, because you kind of never satisfied. It's deeply frustrating, but it's a great honor to be able to put my views forward and do my best. But one thing you do need is a bit of a thick skin. One of my ancestors was probably a rhinoceros, so I get by.
Well, I know you said this was your first Open University event. I hope it won't be your last one.
No, I really am a great admirer of the Open University and the opportunity it gives people. Yeah. Oh, should I do a degree there? I don't know. Tell me.
I think they'd be quite glad to have you. I'm sure I
spend obviously a lot of my day on political work and campaigning and all the rest of it. But what I also do is make sure that I'm reading something that is not necessarily anything to do with what I'm doing day to day. So I've always got 1, 2, or even 3 books on the go at the same time that are a completely different way. It's very important to have variety in your life. Also, grow vegetables. It's good for you if you've got space.
Well, in the event you choose to do a law degree, I hear they've got a great law society that you could join as well if you decide to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, and the comment section is saying thank you as well.
And could I say thank you very much to all of you who've been on this call. I hope you've found it interesting, and I'm always happy to try and talk to people about the ups and downs and joys and sadness and sorrow of political life and political representation. But democracy is about people having their voice and having their voice effectively heard.
Thank you so much.
So we need to change the media as well. We didn't even get onto the media.
We didn't even really get onto the media, but never mind. We covered a lot all the same. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Bye.